Hello, I'm Becky Truguer. Welcome to my channel if you're new, and welcome back if you're a regular subscriber. So as you may or may not know, I live in Melbourne, Australia, and most of the time it's a very dry climate. So this can be quite problematic when it comes to certain types of paint, in particular gouache and acrylic paints. Now recently when I filmed a video using gouache, I used just this ceramic palette here. I put the gouache out onto it, and within maybe 2 minutes the whole lot had fully dried, and I was really hoping to use the gouache wet. Unfortunately that was not to be because it is just so dry here. Even when it's humid we sometimes run the air conditioner and that dries everything out anyway. Now gouache at least will reactivate in water, so it's not a major problem, but if it's acrylic gouache or acrylic paints, anything with acrylic in it really, once it's dried, that's it. It's not going to reactivate with water. It is pretty much done. And I absolutely hate wasting paint, especially when it comes to acrylic paint. And I also get really frustrated with it because it dries so quickly and it's very hard to blend and all of that stuff. So I've been looking around for a wet palette. Wet palettes are used by artists to prolong their paint and keep it wet for a long time, especially if you're an acrylic painter. So basically the concept of a wet palette is it has the base quite flat and shallow. It then has a sponge type thing in the bottom of it where you pour water onto it so it keeps it very wet, funnily enough, and then you lay over the top some kind of parchment paper so that it will sit on the top and retain some of the moisture but not enough so it's completely saturated. You place your paints on the top of it and then you can keep the lid on when you're not using the paints. It will apparently keep them for much longer, a week even, so I thought this would be a really great idea, and I've been looking around online to see which one might be suitable for me. I looked at my local art store and they have the Masterton, I can't say that word, Masterton wet palettes available, but they are massive. I was having a look and they are, you know, about an 11 by 14 size. They're just so large, and yes, that's really great if you're using a lot of paint, but because I'm limited with how much space I have on my desk, especially when I'm filming, I was hoping for something just a little bit more compact. So I took a look around and I found this really cool looking one online, and so today I'm going to be looking at this Army Painter wet palette. Now I have never painted a miniature in my life, so if you're here to check this out, I'm sorry, I'm not an actual miniature painter, but I do all sorts of other kind of art, and I figured it will be quite a crossover to use this in my art. Of course, when I was browsing, I see that Army Painter have all sorts of other things, like these little miniature brushes and oh, so many cute things, all of their huge range of paints for painting miniatures. Oh, what a rabbit hole that is, and I think I might avoid that, although I could see the appeal in painting miniatures, and maybe that is something I will do in the future. But for now, I just want the palette. So let's go down to the desk. I'm going to open it and we will see what it's like together. I've never used a wet palette before. I know you can make them at home, but I'm just way too lazy for that. I think for my first one at least I would like to have a palette, and my cat has just jumped up behind me. Oh, Gandalf. Yes, you naughty boy. I'm gonna keep that in. Oh my god. He does this all the time. It's like his favorite thing that he wants to sit on my shoulders while I'm painting. It's so cute, but man, he's heavy. He's like 7 kilos of just fluff. Anyway, let's get down to the desk and we'll check out this Army palette together. So after a lot of pats, Gandalf is now safely away in another room, so he can't bother me in here. But when I was doing my shopping around, I did see there are quite a lot of different types of wet palettes for miniature painting, and it took me a while to decide which one to get. In the end, I went with this one because it's the first one I saw. It just really appeals to me. I just think it looks really nice and I like the box, so that's the one I've gone with. They are quite easily available, at least in Australia, and I imagine in America. I will post some links to them. They're on Amazon, but I actually purchased mine from an Australian and New Zealand website called Mighty Ape, and they're actually really good. I've used them a few times to buy some vinyl records and all sorts of things. I bought some watercolour paper from them, and I will link them them in the description below. I ordered this and it was shipped to me within about 3 or 4 days, which is actually pretty good. It did get shipped from New Zealand, I think, too. So if you live in Australia or New Zealand, do check them out. They're a really great alternative to Amazon. Let's get this thing open because I have been looking at it for a few days. It's reflecting off the plastic, and so I just need to peel this plastic off and we can check it out. What I liked the look of with this palette is it also comes with a little brush holder, but it has 2 hydrofoams, which are the part that you wet, and then these little hydro sheets, so they're already cut. I don't have to worry about measuring things out and trying to cut paper up myself. I don't really know what kind of paper to use. I've got some kitchen paper, but I don't know if that's super great, so I figured it would probably be better to get something that's actually designed for this purpose. Just before I open it, I'll flip it over to the back so we can see what's on here. See, perfect for acrylic paints. I imagine gouache should hopefully work as well. Let's get into it because I can't wait. It's all beautifully packaged in there. Oh my gosh, there's quite a lot of stuff in here. There. So these are the main components of the wet palette. And then there's also some other stuff here which looks quite interesting. I mean, I'm not into any of this kind of stuff. There is a store in Australia, or Melbourne at least, called Warhammer. I could see the appeal of painting these little miniatures, and I would definitely have a look in the store to see if there's any which look quite interesting. Maybe some dragons or something like that. So curious just to have a look, but I could see it being a really expensive hobby. Just the paints themselves, they come in these huge packs and they're not cheap. Here's some of their other products. What's this? Oh, there's a whole guide in here. That's really great, especially for someone like me who has no clue about miniatures. So I'm definitely going to have to read this in my spare time. Okay, let's get into the wet palette. So it's a plastic container, but it feels like a solid one. It's got a nice little band around it, which I really like. And that's stuck to it, that's why it's not coming off. That doesn't come apart, that's just a band like that. Inside is the paintbrush holder. That actually sits on quite nicely. And underneath is the part where you put the sponge and everything. I was really tempted to buy a set of their mini brushes, but I behaved myself because I so don't need them, and I am quite pleased to see that these ones actually fit in there. These are just regular brushes I have in my collection. That one's a bit too tall, but that one works. So smaller brushes will fit in there quite nicely. They're a little bit loose in there, but I guess that somewhere at least you can store them. My actual mini brush is too fat in the handle to fit in there. Never mind, I could put it on the side. But there we go, I've got some brushes in there, I'm happy. Except for that one, it doesn't fit. Wah! Now to open this, I'm very glad it's got a guide in here too, especially for novices like me who've never used a wet palette before. It's only a very thin one, but at least there's something in there to explain how to use it, because I really don't know. I have watched a few videos, but it's always different when it's right in front of you and have to use it. Oh, that's nice. They even have a card if you've got something wrong with your things. Great. So these are the papers that go on the top, and inside are these 2 hydrofoams. Now I've seen a few people complain about it, and I can kind of see why. They are folded over, and so it is going to leave a bit of a crease, and people were saying that's kind of annoying, but that's about the only downside I've found to this palette in all of my research. I like that at least there's a spare one though. So it's a very soft foam. Look at that crease in it. I guess that will come out with time. If I bend it just gently the other way, I might be able to take most of it out. It's kind of odd because the papers are flat, so I don't see why they couldn't put these flat in the package. That's just a strange thing, and if Army Painter ever happened to see that, maybe that's something you could improve in the future, is just to lay these hydrofoams out flat as well. So let's put this in here. It's a little bit smaller, but I think once the water's added, it's going to expand into it. And I think that's what I need to do now, is actually put some water in. I've got some water in the old Ned Kelly mug here. And according to this, you're supposed to soak it in water and then place it in the tray. I think I'm just going to actually pour the water into the tray for the purposes of this video. And maybe what I will do is actually move all the other things away from the water so that I don't make a huge mess everywhere. Of course, my cup has got cat hair in it, thanks to Gandalf, so I'm just going to go and replace that quickly. I have no idea how much water to put in. I'm sure I can tip it out if it's too much. But I'll just be gentle and pour some on to let that soak in. That ridge is super annoying, by the way. I really hope it goes away with time. It's kind of fascinating watching that. I'll put more in so that it can soak as much as possible, and then I'll tip the excess out. I think that's the best solution here. So I'll just give this a few moments to absorb as much water as possible. So that is completely saturated, and I think I've got way too much water in here to begin with, so I will tip off some of this excess. You can probably see the water on there, and this ridge seems to have gone down for the most part, which I'm very thankful for. So next up, we need to add one of these bits of paper onto it. It feels a lot like baking paper. It's not quite centered, but I think that's actually okay because it means I can pour water down the edges. It's wrinkled a tiny bit, but it's not bad. I've managed to get water all over it already. I think it's squeezed up from the side here. This thing says squeegee away any pockets of air between the hydro sheet and foam. I don't have anything that's a squeegee. Well, that worked okay. It wasn't nearly as difficult as I thought it was going to be. So from my understanding of how this works, this hydro sheet forms a semi-permeable membrane, so I can place my paints on here and it's not going to disperse into the water, but the moisture is enough that it will come through to keep those paints wet. So I guess the only way to find out if this is actually going to work is to put some paints on here. I have an assortment of gouache here by Art Spectrum, which is an Australian company. I've picked out some colours that I'm probably going to use. I found a picture of this rainbow lorikeet and I think he's really cool. This is also an Australian bird, so I figured the Art Spectrum would be great for this. As usual, I'm learning as I'm filming, and one of the first mistakes I made was to squeeze out too much paint. I should have really used a palette knife or something to put the paints out, just to have a little more control as to how much paint came out. Most of them were okay, but that white just went everywhere. And my second mistake here was putting that red paint too close to the edge of the paper. This will come into play in a little while, but I'm starting on this rainbow lorikeet, painting in the blue parts first. If you look in that top right corner, you can see the black is starting to run across the paper, and that's because some of the paper had gotten wet on the top side from me squeegeeing it. I guess this is probably not a great idea, and you want to keep the top of the paper as dry as possible because the paints will run, especially gouache. But otherwise, this wet palette worked exactly as I wanted it to, and it kept all of my gouache paints wet for the entire painting. So the great thing about this was I was able to get a much more opaque look to the painting because the gouache was wet, rather than trying to reactivate it with water, which really does dilute it down, and I always end up making it look like watercolors. So this is the first time I really got to use gouache as it is meant to be used, in that nice thick opaque layering. The white especially is excellent for going over the top to get the feather details. So you can see on the palette the paint is still very much wet, even on the thinner areas where I've mixed the paint, such as that blue and white area. But oh dear, that black just keeps on spreading out, doll. So I'm getting hungry. I think I'm going to take a break for lunch. This is still extremely wet. You can probably see that on my finger when I just lightly touch it, so I think there's still plenty of water in there. That black is oozing, but I took a bit of a closer look and it has not come off the paper. It's not underneath on the sponge. So I'm just going to close the box up. This bit does need to be inside for the lid to close properly. And I've stuck the band on to make sure it's well and truly closed. So let's see what happens when I come back from lunch. It's been about an hour. I've had a nice leisurely lunch. Now I'm going to open this again and see if there's any change inside. Oh, we've got a bit of a mess going on. Wow, that has really stayed wet in there, to the point where everything has run quite considerably, especially some of these ones. So this is gouache and not acrylic paint. I don't know if acrylic paints are going to run quite as much as what these ones are doing. That's totally crazy. I might need to fix this up a bit. Of course I've got paint on the sponge bit now, which is annoying. I am sure this is going to get stained over time anyway. But that's really interesting to see what happens when you actually close the box up. But anyway, I'm just going to work with it. I might have to put a few more paints out because that's a right old mess. I will see what I can salvage out of this, and I will continue painting. I really am astounded with how liquidy the paints have become just in that single hour of keeping the lid on. It shows you just how well the moisture is being trapped inside the box. I had seen a few reviews complaining that the Army Painter does not have a rubber seal around the edges, but in my case it really doesn't seem to make any difference because I was still getting so much moisture inside the box, and when I put the paintbrush section in, it fits so well in there that it creates almost an airtight seal anyway, apparently. But I am just loving how those wet gouache paints are going on so brightly, and I was able to get a really intense colour. This is a rainbow lorikeet. They really are this bright. They are such beautiful birds, but boy, they are noisy. This year they found our apple tree quite early before we had netted it, and they ate every single apple off it. I'm so mad, but they just sit in the tree, and all I could hear for about a week or so is them talking to each other, just like parrots do. And I'm grateful to live in an area where we do get a lot of parrots, so I can't complain too much. But back to the painting, I had a lot of fun with this. It's the first time I've really enjoyed gouache and not been frustrated with it drying out on my palettes too quickly. I will definitely try out acrylic paints in another video. This one took a bit longer than expected to film, so I'll come up with another painting using only acrylics so we can see if there's much difference with the way they behave on here. I also think I added a bit too much water. At least for gouache, I would maybe just make the sponge damp rather than saturated, so that is also something I need to try out. It's a learning curve, and we will all be learning together apparently, because I had no idea what I was doing when I first started this. I still had heaps of paint left over at the end of that artwork, and there's no way I was going to leave it in the wet palette after how much it had run in just 1 hour, so I have picked up most of it and I was painting it into my sketchbook. I taped off the edges just to try and minimize the mess. You can see that paint is all over the sponge, but I just took a whole bunch and layered it on top of each other into the sketchbook, doing a little bit of an abstract. Nothing in particular, just getting that paint off the wet palette, because I do want to leave this palette overnight to see what happens to the paints, but with less paint just in case they run even further. I guess this is another good way to show just how opaque gouache can be when it's wet and how well it layers on top of each other. So I actually really liked how this little abstract turned out, even though it wasn't anything particular other than me removing the paint. It looks pretty cool, I think. Well, that didn't turn out too badly, all things considered, and at least it's used up most of the paint. Now I've left some in here because I'm really curious to see how this is going to go overnight. I've taken off most of it, so hopefully it won't make too much more mess than what it already has. It's a bit drier than it was before, but that sponge is still quite saturated. You can see the water there, so I'm not going to add any more water. I'm just going to put the lid on it. It's the next day, so I'm going to open this and see if anything has changed overnight. Okay, so as you can see, it is still extremely wet, and the paints that I have left on here have run quite a lot. They are pure liquid. So even the areas where there's only a tiny amount of paint, that is still very much wet. So it's worked extremely well. Probably a little too well because we are actually having unusually humid weather. And it's been very warm too. That's somewhat dry, that little bit there. But otherwise, it's still wetter, seemingly, than what I had yesterday. It's made kind of a cool pattern on here. So I think I'm actually going to take out this piece of paper and give this sponge a bit of a wash. I will probably let this piece of paper dry because the gouache, as I said, will reactivate once it's dry. But it's just made quite a mess, and I've learned a few things here, like not putting the paints too close to the edge of the paper for one of them. I don't really want to chuck it out like this because it will make a horrible mess in my bin anyway, so it needs to dry before I do anything else with it. You can see on the sponge some of the blue has actually seeped through the paper, and I think that just naturally happens, and of course I've got bits and pieces around the edges. The sponge itself, you can see how much water is still in there. Perhaps I put too much water in. Maybe it would work a little bit better, at least in my climate, to put slightly less water on there, and then it won't run as much. So I've rinsed out the sponge and given it a bit of a squeeze, so it's mostly dry now. I think it's probably best to not leave this just soaked in water because it's going to get very smelly and possibly moldy. So I have just let it dry out a bit, and I'll probably just lay it across like that just so it's not completely sticking to the plastic, and I will save this for the next use. It's never going to be perfect again. So overall, with my first use of this wet palette, I'm really impressed with it. In fact, it worked a little too well, but I was so happy that my gouache stayed wet for the whole time. I was able to achieve just such a better layering effect and a much richer, more pigmented colour because I was able to lay that wet paint on more thickly than if I was reactivating it with water. So I'm really happy with that. I think this video is going to be quite long as it is, so I'm going to have to revisit this Army Painter with some acrylic paints and do an acrylic painting. I'm not as confident with acrylic paints, so I thought I would start with the gouache because that's something that I tend to use a bit more, at least lately. So stick around and be sure to subscribe to my channel because I will no doubt be using this quite a lot in the future and featuring it a bit more heavily. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and I hope you're all having a fantastic day out there. I will see you all again really soon in my next video. Swatch you later. Bye! Gandalf, say bye-bye to the viewers, since you've been hanging out there again when I was filming it. There you go. This guy wants to come and jump on my shoulders once again. Send help!